Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Harold Brown. He served 23 years in uniform as a World War II veteran and a member of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. And Colonel Brown, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Let's start at the beginning of your story, sir. Where were you born and raised?
Minneapolis, Minnesota. And at the age of 6, I decided I wanted to become a pilot.
Why?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't really have an answer for it. As a matter of fact, my mother always had other dreams for me. And it's strange how mothers can look at their sons or daughters and see all this potential. And somehow or other, she saw me as being a great pianist. And I did not have the talent for it. But nevertheless, I came home and I practiced religiously and whatnot. And then one day I woke up, I was in the 6th grade, and I decided I want to become a pilot. And I have no how it came about. And from that point on, I spent the rest of my days reading everything I could find about, in particular, Randolph Field, West Point of the Air, down in Texas. I built all the models imaginable. And this continued up until I was 16 years old. And at 16 years old, I was a soda jerk. I saved up $35, went out to Woolworth Chamberlain, found the fixed base operator, and told him I want to take flying lessons. I said, I got $35. He says, well, that will get you 5 flying lessons. And I said, hopefully I'll have 35 more when that finishes. I never got the other 35. But when I tell youngsters that, I have $35. And I've already computed what $35 would be in today's money with all of the changes. It will amount to just about $740. And I always ask them, and you guys got $740 in your pocket? I have 35, that's the equivalent. No, we don't have this, but that's how I got started.
Yeah, that's amazing. So how old are you when Pearl Harbor is attacked?
Pearl Harbor was declared on the 7th of December 1941, and I graduated from high school 17 years old in June, 6 months later, in 1942.
Okay.
And at that time, they had changed the requirements. Earlier than that, a little history. They had a big debate going on. They finally decided, okay, we'll train you guys. And Roosevelt made a decision in March of 1941 that, yes, we will train a squadron. So 1941, the war hadn't even started yet. And there were 13 people in the first class, all college graduates, 3 of them were master's degree. And the 13th one was Captain B.O. Davis, who was the West Point graduate, and he was in that first class. So that gives you something about the time frame. And that class started up in July of 1941. By the time I graduated, they had completely depleted that whole pool of pilots and whatnot, potential pilots that had some college training, and they said, we will accept high school graduates if they could pass the exams and the physical exams. And that is how I got in. I went down, took them all, and was accepted.
What was it like when you got to Tuskegee?
Well, we were excited. It's interesting because we got down to Biloxi, Mississippi, and that was in January of 1942. Yes. No, January of 43, because I graduated in June 42. And there were about 600 of us down, and that's where they sent you for your basic training. And it's interesting, they retested us, which was the same identical test, and I said, that's awful strange. And then out of the 600, they only took the top 300 and washed the other 300 out. And there is where I was introduced to, there is a quota system, and you're going to have to get used to it. And that was perhaps the most unfairest thing that I witnessed throughout my entire program. It wasn't about your flying skills or whatnot. You had they had to meet the quota. There's only going to be X number of them that graduate, and there's only going to be X number of them total. And that's what they went by.
And so, as you observed it, were there a lot of good people who didn't get in, or were there some not so good people who did?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, geez. It was loaded. And there were two things. When you took the exams, the other guys were immediately sworn into the reserve and was just waiting for a class start. When my paperwork had to go to Washington, D.C., and it was in Washington, D.C. where they made selections as to who would or who would not be allowed in the training. And I can remember there were, well, later on I learned there were just hundreds of guys, literally thousands of them, who applied, never heard anything, and the draft caught up with them. And that was I was beginning to worry about, because I turned 18 in August, and I said, boy, if I don't hear something, I could be drafted. And so many of the guys were drafted and never even got the opportunity. And I mean, it was literally in the thousands, the guys who never got the opportunity. But here again, this whole thing of quotas.
How did you and the other members of your unit look at this opportunity? Since President Roosevelt had recently created it, was this your chance to prove yourselves? Because
oh, absolutely. Well, early in our years, I don't think that most of the younger guys that came in really understood that we were perhaps making history or there was something special about us. We were nothing but a bunch of young kids who wanted to fly. Now, perhaps some of the older ones who came in, and there were many of them, which college graduates and whatnot, saw it just a little differently. But I didn't. All I wanted to do was fly, and that was it. And I finally got the opportunity, and I was living out my dream. And I was totally consumed by that. And that was the driving thing that just drove me, and kept me focused and right on track. And it wasn't until I was much later in my life that I thought about it. And the more I thought about it, the more we talked about it, we said, we really did something special. Mm-hmm. And this was particularly true in 1948 when Truman announced that he was going to integrate, and which he did in 1949. But if we had not been as successful as we were, there's no way that Truman would have possibly made that move. So, yeah, we did accomplish something. And when you reflect back, the first Civil Rights Act wasn't passed until 1964, right. So 19 years later. And here we have been integrated 19 years before the first Civil Rights Act was even passed. And it's interesting, and then in the book that my wife and I wrote, she was so surprised to learn that it was the military who was in the forefront of really the civil rights movement. Because here we were in it since 1949, and I lived in an integrated society while I was on the base, and it wasn't until I left the base that it was back to the old ways again. And she was so surprised that of all the organizations, the military actually were the first ones to integrate. She almost couldn't believe it. Thinking the military would be the very last. But here they were in the forefront of it.
Absolutely. And because they saw the performance of your unit, certainly a factor.
That played a very big role.
And we'll get to that in just a moment. So talk about your training a little bit. Did your lessons back home give you a leg up on some of the other guys, at least at first?
Well, I did take flying lessons, and I did solo a little PT-17 Stearman early. I soloed it in 7.5 hours, which was reasonably fast. And I would like to think that those little 5 hours, but I had almost forgot about those 5 hours by the time I really got into, flight training again. So whether it did or not, I don't know for sure. But I did solo within 7.5 hours. And in primary, we started off with 60 guys, and 20 of them washed out, and 40 of us made it. So we went from there back to basic. And then the class was reasonably held together through basic. But then we went into advanced with 40 cadets. And here we were completing our training. And when we went into advanced, there was a guy from the University of Minnesota. And he asked, was anybody from Minnesota? And I raised my hand. He says, you were? He says, you know the Minnesota fight song? And I said, sure. He says, get on top of that table, dummy, and serenade me with the University of Minnesota fight song. I said, oh, my God, what have I gotten into, you know? And me and this voice, Minnesota hats off the scene. I forgot half of it. He says, oh, my God, you know, get off the table. Big joke. Everybody was laughing. Ha, ha. But about a week or so later, I saw him, and he says, Harold, let's have a chit-chat. So he says, I'm going to give you a heads up. 10 people are going to be washed off out of the class. We can only graduate 30 of you. I said, what? He says, that's right. You come down here, you have your flight suit pressed. Don't you come in here with dirty shoes, nothing. Don't give any of the check pilots any reason to say, mister, get your parachute, you're going up for a check ride, because you aren't going to pass it. And there's where I really saw the unfairness of it, because we were in our final phase. We could all fly, no question about it. As a matter of fact, that another time he had bragged, he says, geez, I've washed out better guys down in Tuskegee that I've graduated in some of the other schools that I've been into. But we did. 10 of the guys were just washed out. Went up for a flight test, came down, you flunked it. And we lost 10 of them. And we graduated with the 30. That was a little difficult to take. You know, it wasn't about flying skills. It was meeting a quota. And I thought, what a hell of a way to, you know, treat people.
Why wouldn't you want the best?
You know, so.
Yeah, exactly.
But that was all about the quota business.
Well, let's get you overseas now.
Okay.
Was it 1944 when you were shipped
Yeah,
overseas?
I graduated in May of 1944. I was overseas. I started overseas in late August. It took us almost 30-some days, all of September, on a big convoy to finally get through the Rock. Saw the Rock of Gibraltar and up to Oran, Africa, there for 3 or 4 days. Then from there up to Naples, Italy. Then we spent almost a week there, and we finally got over the Ramatelli, and that was in very early October. But it took that much time to get over to our base in Ramatelli.
What was your first actual mission against the enemy like?
Well, it's interesting because they had taken our group when we got there, and a big mission was going off. And they only had one strip, and they had 4 squadrons in the strip. And a squadron here, one on this side, and one on this side. The lead squadron would take the runway and line up. And at the appropriate time, they would shoot the flare, and they start flagging them off. We was watching it, and they said, you can watch the takeoff to see what it's like. I saw the worst takeoff in the history of the 332nd. Out of the lead squadron, 5 aircraft lost their engines. 5 of them. One of them pulled off ahead. A few airplanes, another one lost his engine. He pulls off to the right. Another one further down, he loses his engine. He pulls off to the left. Another one loses his. He runs straight ahead into the guy who had pulled straight ahead. Big explosion. A big fire's going on down there. Matter of fact, one of the guys was actually killed in that fire. Great big bonfire going on, and they're still flagging them off. You know, there's a mission to fly. And I thought, man alive, you know, what in the world is going on? And this was our introduction to a full mission, a maximum effort, taking off. So when I flew my first mission, everyone, I then learned the flight was easy. The moment of any apprehension occurred on takeoff, fully loaded, weighing tanks, the rest of it. Everyone sweated that engine off. Once you broke ground, it was a piece of cake. Then you were on your way. No problems. Matter of fact, eager beavers, hoping that the enemy would practically jump some of the bombers so we could really, engage them. But takeoff, there was always that little apprehension. Is this engine going to do as advertised and get me airborne? That's the only thing that's really sweated out.
There was a lot to lift off the ground.
Oh, yes.
What type of German resistance did you face typically on
Actually,
mission,
not
either
that much.
in the air or on the ground with anti-aircraft?
By that time, we would occasionally see German aircraft, and there were several missions in which there were some fairly heavy dogfights. As a matter of fact, when you interview Harry Stewart, he shot down 3 airplanes in one day. And that was our biggest day. Over a 2-day period, we got 25 victories. And that was right towards the end of the war, towards the end of March. I believe it was March 31st and April 1st. But rare did you ever encounter Germans in that large a number. You would see small numbers of them. Occasionally they would come into the bombers and you would intercept them. But that was just about it. Now, the only other new thing that they introduced is when they introduced the Me-262, which was a twin-engine German jet, and because it was about 100 miles an hour faster than what we were, and I had an encounter with one of those, and I wound up trying to get home. I should have broke it off early, trying to get back home. I had fuel exhaustion, and I got over the bomb line and. I death-sticked my airplane on old bandit landing strip, tore it to pieces. But boy, my squadron commander chewed me out. Why didn't you break off earlier? You tore up one of my airplanes. Why did you? Oh, he really chewed me out for it. And rightly so, because I should have broken off a long time, but for a short while I had that Me-262 in my gun sight. And some of the guys often ask, how in the world could you ever get a 262 in your gun sight? Well, quite easily, because the Germans with the 262 would just come straight across and make a straight pass into the bomber formation, through the bomber formation, out the other side. Well, if you could time it right, and you always had an altitude advantage, there was a little 2 to 3 second window as he comes streaking through, and as you're pulling yourself in the position for about 2 or 3 seconds, you have the opportunity to get off a burst. If you're lucky, you get a hit. Other than that, they go level and they separate you. 100 miles an hour separation speed, he's gone. On this day, the guy, instead of doing that, rolled over and went down. I said, what the hell is he doing that for? He's already at max speed. I'm not at max speed. Gravity is going to help me, but not him. So instead of separating himself at 100 miles an hour, now I have cut that speed down to something like 40, 50 miles an hour. So it means then that he stays in my gun sight an extra 4, 5, 6 seconds or more. But even though he's getting smaller and smaller and smaller in my gun sight, he's still in my gun sight. And me and my wingman are just shooting like crazy. Of course, we didn't hit him. And then we broke off and we tried to get back home. We ran across a flat track and we both got hit. And I ran out of fuel, lost my radios and all this stuff. And I crash landed in my airplane back in friendly territory. But that is how I kept an Me-262 in my gun sight so I could really shoot off a number of rounds. But I just had probably a green pilot in the 262, or else he was the dumbest pilot I ever met in my life, whatever it was.
Well, that was the second worst mission probably that you had. Tell us about your 30th mission.
Okay, we were on a special 15th Air Force mission, and they selected us to strafing area, and they gave the mission to the 332nd, and it went to the 1990 Fighter Squadron. So we got maximum airplane, went up, and sure enough, we did that we didn't ordinarily do. We took off at daybreak, and we got up there and caught them with all this heavy traffic. It was from Linz, Austria, about 100 miles southeast. And we started way down at this end, and we drop off a flight of four, and I was in the lead flight, and we went all the way up to Linz. And you could just hear all the chatter, the guys, I got this one blew up, all kinds of chatter. We had perhaps one of the best days in terms of destroying locomotive and railroad traffic that we ever had. Mm-hmm. And that was the mission coming back down. There's always that last one. And the guys were circling, and we were going up to join them to go home, and that's when Major Campbell, who was leading it, and I was his wingman that day, said, oh, we missed one. Let's go get him, Harold. And that was the one that got me. As he broke off, he ran out of ammo. I went in and lit him up like a Christmas tree. I said, why doesn't this damn thing blow? And just as I pulled up to get out of there, that's when it blew. And some of the debris and whatnot hit my engine just enough, and that's an inline engine. If you hit the right coolant line, you can bring a 51 down with a pistol if you could hit that coolant line. And I lost all my coolant and ran for just a couple of minutes, and I had to bail out of it. Of course, the rest is history. But that was perhaps the scariest thing that happened to me, because they picked me up and they took me right back to the village that we had been strafing. And we were met by perhaps the angriest 35 group of people I have ever seen in my life. And there was no doubt that they had murder in their mind, and they made sure that I knew what they were going to do. So here I was, and matter of fact, I was actually talking to myself, what are you going to do, Harold? I don't know what I'm going to do. What, you got to think of something, Harold. Do something. Well, what am I going to do? And I was trying to reconcile the fact that, Harold, you're going to die in a matter of minutes here. And lo and behold, there was one good guy in the crowd, a constable in the back. And I saw him back there, but I didn't pay any attention to him. Next thing I knew, I felt his hand on my shoulder. He snatches me back. He steps in front of me, puts a round in the rifle, and held a rifle on him. Now, he had friends. He had to know everybody in that crowd if he's a constable there. But he stopped them from killing me. But for those first 35 minutes or so, I knew I was going to die. I could see no way out of it, and trying to reconcile the fact that, Harold, you only got a few more minutes to live. And 20 years old, had no business. I was telling myself, you got no business being up here in Germany, and you're getting ready to die. The scariest thing I've ever experienced in my life.
Just a couple minutes left, sir. How were you treated as a prisoner of war?
It was fine. Actually, once you got into a BOW camp, that became the safe haven. When you were out there in the hinterlands, they always briefed us, get as far away from the target area as you possibly can. Stay with your airplane. If you have to bail, bail at the last minute, but get as far away as you can. And for the obvious reason, if you are escorting bombers, they're dropping bombs all over the place. In our case, if you're strafing or whatever you're doing, there's a whole lot of angry civilians down there. And if they see you in a parachute, then you're going to be in a great deal of difficulty. And the best thing you could do was to be picked up by soldiers and for them to take you to a prison camp, because the prison camp became the safe haven. Harry Stewart will have an interesting story about his wingman that went down, Walter Manning. And it was just here a few years ago that they discovered what happened to Walt Manning. As a matter of fact, I think Harry may have gone over, you can get all the details from here. But they hung his wingman. And it's interesting, I saw another friend of mine when I got to Nuremberg, where they had the interrogation center. And as I came down, I saw them bringing in a few prisoners, and there was a good friend of mine who was in Harry Stewart's class right behind me, Lincoln T. Hudson. He didn't have, there wasn't a part of his body that wasn't bruised. And I went back and said, Lincoln, what happened, whatnot? And I had a chance to chat with him for a few minutes. And he says, oh, Harold, I had to bail out, whatnot. And he says, the civilians grabbed me. And he says, they beat me. He says, I was picked up by 2 soldiers, but then the 2 soldiers met a mob of civilians. And they just turned me over to them. And they just stomped him, beat him, did everything. So he said he laid there just as quiet as he could to pretend he was half dead, which he was half dead. And they finally left him alone. The 2 guards picked him up and drug him off. But that guy was an absolute, how he, and what he went through was just, terrible. But that's what happens if you ever went down, and if you ever went down, and if the civilians got you, you were in deep, deep trouble. And as I reflect back on it, I said, come on, wise up, Harold. How would you feel if I was the civilian? They're dropping bombs on me, they're strafing me, and I see a guy come down in a parachute. I would be so angry, get that you-know-what. And I can understand it from a very rational point of view when I'm not in that situation, but sitting back and looking at it. It made all the sense in the world for them to be extremely angry and want to take your life. So that's the way it was. So at all costs, you always try to avoid the civilians or the civilian areas whenever you went down.
What was it like after serving your country with such distinction, then coming back to America the way it was in 1945?
Well, nothing had changed. It was exactly the way I had left it. But it was interesting. My attitude on it was, look, this is the way I had lived all my life. I don't know any other way to live. I can either let that hinder me, or I can just deal with it. Because I had always set goals for myself, and I had goals to obtain, and that was just to me a useless battle, a battle that I wasn't going to win. I had lived with it all my life, so just do what you have to do, and there will come a time. It's interesting, Dryden, who wrote a book, The A Train, and the University of Alabama Press published it the way they had published mine. But I always remember something that Dryden wrote in his book, because he was asked a similar question. And Dryden's answer was always that this is perhaps the greatest country in the world. There's no doubt about it. And he says, I fully believe that they have the capacity to change. And as long as I keep that thought in mind, then everything will change as time goes on. And that was pretty much the way it all worked out, And of course, we still got some problems that we still got to resolve, but it'll get better and better and better.
Well, that's the best attitude to have. And you mentioned the
progress
you've seen in your life, certainly
Absolutely.
From military integration to the Civil Rights Act and even an African-American president eventually. So, Mr. Brown, thank you so much for your service.
Okay.
And thank you very much for your time with us today.
It was a pleasure.
Lieutenant Colonel and Doctor, I might add, PhD recipient Harold Brown served 23 years in uniform, World War II veteran, and a member of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.